НЛО Медиа представляет. Хроника научной жизни.
Предоставляю слово
I'm very happy to pass
Хансу Ульриху
the mic
Гумбрехту,
to Hans Ульрich Gumbrехт, Stanford University, US. The title of the talk is Does Communal Life Need Borders? About the status of space in the human condition.
Thank you, Irina, and thank you for having me at the 30th Bath readings, formerly bathhouse readings. I have a certain bias against being remote. So let me start by expressing my hope to be physically present in Moscow in the not too remote future. Now, my understanding of the topic of this colloquium, my understanding of the agenda that I think mainly you, Irina, not exclusively have developed goes like this. There is an invitation to unfold the semantic complexity, the epistemological complexity of the word border, that is, has many connotations, many complex, unfolds a complex semantic field, a confusing semantic field, and of course, with that, an urge to try and start systematizing. I think especially the second and the third talk today have followed that, have unfolded this enormous complexity and started to propose some systematizations. At the same time, to a certain degree, I had the impression from the topics that were announced that there is in general a consensus of having a critical feeling, a critical bias against borders. So there is a certain romanticism in the humanities about transgression. We have heard about that with ambiguous results, etc., etc. So I think this is the agenda. Now, within this agenda, what I want to do, and I will try to respect the 20 minutes, which is difficult, is as follows. I will not make an effort to unfold the complexity, the semantic complexity, however important that may be, but I will use the word borders in the everyday sense of the word. And most people think about the border like the Mexican-American border or formerly the European borders. I was yesterday writing in a book of when I first crossed the German-French border at Saarbrücken, for example. That was in the year 1964, so you had to show your passport, there were border agents, and then you had this feeling to be in a different country. So that's the very simple semantic implication when I talk about borders. With the, not bias, but with the connection that borders are related in this everyday sense to nations and nationhood, right? I mean, so if you think about formerly when I first went to France from Germany, where does France start and where does Germany end? That's related to the border, also in a national sense. So the semantics of the everyday word border in connection with nationhood, in connection with the concept of the nation. And my point is, more strongly than Ed in the previous lecture, I would like to make an argument in defense of borders. And I would like to make an argument that sounds very strange, especially from somebody born in Germany, in defense of nationhood. I do think that, at least in the European discussion, I don't know whether Boris agrees with me, there is a certain secret comeback of the concept of nationhood. And as an intellectual, you have to be against that. But maybe I want to make the case there is something to nationhood that is not only negative. So that would be my agenda. I know it's a provocative agenda, but that may have been my tradition in the contributions to the Bath readings. Now, let me start with a very brief historical survey about the intellectual feelings regarding borders. Why do intellectuals normally react critically, not to say hysterically, when the word border or the word nationhood comes up, and this continues until the present day? I mean, quite obviously, this is a legacy, this is an inheritance of enlightenment. Yeah. I mean, what was the great innovation intellectually, discursively of enlightenment? It was the claim to talk about humankind if possible. Yeah, if you think of Hume or being born in Germany, of Kant as the great Enlightenment philosophers, I mean, Kant hardly ever speaks in the name of Prussians. I mean, that was the state he was belonging to. He speaks in the name of humankind, and that's what Enlightenment does. And even if you think about the French Revolution, I mean, the French Revolution that we call the French Revolution, from its early beginnings and then more extremely after 1792, was supposed to be a revolution that would embrace nationhood as a form of existence without borders. And I think this is the legacy, this is the intellectual inheritance that we have as intellectuals. And by intellectuals, I mean, conceptually speaking, the word intellectuals was invented by Zola, by the novelist Zola, in the so-called Dreyfus affair. But by intellectuals, I mean people who believe in the life of the mind and who, even like most of us do, make the life of the mind their profession. So intellectuals normally have a bias against border, against nationhood. To let me give some examples. In the 19th century, quite justified, morally and politically justified bias against imperialism. Because imperialism, we tend to forget, that was always executed in the name of nation. Yeah? That was the English nation controlling part of the world, imposing their nationhood on other peoples, as they would saying. There was the French territories, or there was this German saying, am deutschen Wesen muss die Welt genesen. So the world will become healthy, it will become more German. I mean, thank goodness there was not much territory left when Germany started becoming imperialist, but nevertheless, there was this kind of healing the world in the name of the German nationhood. So that was, of course, triggered a critical reaction among intellectuals. Or think of World War I, that strengthened this prejudice. I mean, World War I in its destructive power compared to World War II was pretty negligible, but it was a new war. This is why we call it World War I. It had a destructive power that had never been experienced before, and it was a war very emphatically, historically, that was fought in the name of nations. Nations were confronted. In that case, especially, and as a core confrontation, Germany and France. So again, critical reaction from intellectuals. And then, of course, you have the fascisms. The first fascism, the invention of fascism, is indeed Italian, but then fascism that deteriorated in Nazism in Germany in the name of nationhood. I mean, there has been no more emphatic emphasis on nationhood than in fascism. So all these reactions explain why, until the present day, and as a legacy from Enlightenment, intellectuals have negative reactions to borders and negative reactions to nationhood. Let me make one footnote here. Currently, among intellectuals, there is a way to treat synonymously nationhood and fascism. But I want to make a point here that terminologically speaking, conceptually speaking, not every nationality, however biased you may be against it, is equal to fascism. Because I would say, historically speaking, fascism always implies a mythology of redemption. Yeah? And that can be proven historically when Mussolini first talks about fascism. He talks about the so-called terre irredente, the unredeemed territories. And these were territories that Italy claimed were Italian, but that had been occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they had to be redeemed. And what does redemption mean? Redemption means that you have to make a sacrifice, a physical sacrifice, and that physical sacrifice magically will give you the moral right to repossess those territories. In the Italian case, this is very funny. This is too funny not to mention it. It was a naval defeat of the Italian Navy in the 1860s against the Austro-Hungarian Navy. You wouldn't even believe that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a navy. It was called Donau Marine, but they lost against them. And there was quite a physical loss. So that the sacrifice was made, and this sacrifice would entitle fascism to occupy the unredeemed territories. So the point that I want to make here is that fascism is a specific kind of nationality that implies a mythology of redemption, and that mythology of redemption has as a necessity two physical sacrifices. First, a physical self-sacrifice, that was the defeat of the Italian Navy against the Austro-Hungarian Navy, and then the right to repossess, to reconquer the lost territories by physical power. So not every insistence on nationhood and nationality is fascist, as intellectuals try to suppose today. So much about this prehistory. There is a bias among intellectuals, and that becomes very strong in reaction to World War II. I mean, in reaction to World War II, you can say, and they were actually founded close to where I'm speaking from, at 25 miles in San Francisco. The United Nations as a rebirth, as the so-called League of Nations that was founded in 1919. And I find, interestingly, the League of Nations was the idea of a professional intellectual, of a US president, Woodrow Wilson, who had previously been the president of Princeton University. So he had this idea of a League of Nations precisely to dispossess morally nations. This is a beautiful idea that was reborn in the United Nations. And I think the foundational document of the United Nations tells you that there was a dream of an institution that would ultimately make possible an existence of humankind in the Enlightenment dream. I mean, a humankind without borders, but we can say today that the UN at best has deteriorated in a parliament whose representatives are nations. Yeah, I mean, it is not. I mean, this idea of abandoning nationhood is no longer the agency of the UN. It is no longer about United Nations. It's a kind of strange parliament of nations without military power. There has been another, for my generation of people born in Europe, important idea of abandoning borders, and that, of course, is the European Union. From my own memory, I would say it is interesting, since my times in high school, in the gymnasium, there has always been a certain mythology about the European Union and how beautiful it is. It never developed a great traction in Europe, but nevertheless, it developed a traction administratively. The European Union today exists, and many people say it is a very, very expensive administrative nightmare. Yeah, I mean, the cost of the European Union, and I talk of monetary cost, is very, very high. And at the same time today, you have this renaissance of what people refer to of national identities. So one could critically say that in a way, the existing European Union is the leftover of a dream that has never been fulfilled. So much about this ambiguity that intellectuals feel about, on the one hand, wanting to abandon borders, wanting to abandon nationhood, and on the other hand, never being successful with that. So in the sense, the history of the UN, Woodrow Wilson and what follows, or the history of the European Union is proof of that. So that was my first part. I mean, elaborating a little bit the history of this ambiguity, which, by the way, Boris, I think this ambiguity you developed systematically in a very, for me, very, very impressive way. I mean, when we're talking about migration, migrants, and so forth, maybe the problem is more ambiguous, specifically in Europe, than we normally admit. Let me now pass to a more conceptual, a more phenomenological, philosophical approach. And that is a little bit what my title is announcing about the status of space in the human condition. And my main reference will be phenomenology and really the founding figure, philosophically speaking, and that is Edmund Husserl. I mean, Husserl asks himself where the quote-unquote realities that we call time and space come from. I think the answer he gives to space is for time is quite convincing. He says, and that is a Husserl quote, time is the form of human consciousness. He uses the German concept Bewusstsein. Time is the form of the human mind. And what he means is what is intuitively easy to check, that each present moment is surrounded by what he calls a protension, a fraction of a second that we anticipate the future, and the retention, a fraction of a second, that's memory. So retention is not synonymous to the past, but as Husserl is saying, this form of consciousness is the origin for the unfolding of what we call time. Yeah, I mean, three-dimensional, past, present, and future. And I will come back to temporality. Now, Husserl asks the structurally analogous question for space, and the answer is, where does space come from, phenomenologically speaking? Space comes from the physical presence of a body. From the physical presence of a body, and this is an argument Heidegger picks up in Being and Time, for example. So wherever you are, with your body as a physical reality, certain objects in your environment are reachable with your hands and others are not. And this precisely, this presence, this physical presence of your body is the origin of what we call space. Certain things at a certain moment are unreachable for you, others are reachable. I mean, like this Coke can, everybody knows that I'm addicted to Coke, is reachable for me, and wine bottles at home are not reachable for me at this moment. Now, interestingly, because there's an interesting difference, humanity, as we may say, have reached a global articulation of temporality. Yeah, this did not always exist. An interesting example is, if you go through the railroad station in Bern, the capital of the Swiss Federation, Helvetian Federation, they don't say capital of Switzerland, you see that around 1900, the different cantons of Switzerland had different times. So if you went from the canton of Bern to the canton of Basel, you had to change your time. I mean, there were minutes of difference. But around 1900, I don't know the exact date, there was an agreement on time zones. So, for example, as I'm speaking from California, from the American West Coast, I'm 10 hours behind Moscow. I mean, the day is finishing for you and the day is still starting for me. And there seems to be an easy agreement on that. I mean, I don't see any governments who at this point are forcefully claiming or threatening that we should tame time zones. On the other hand, as far as space is concerned, there have been dreams of abandoning space, or there have been dreams to not divide the globe, but to draw spatial forms on the globe, but there has never been an agreement on that. There has never been an agreement on that. There's still maybe dreams. I mean, maybe the EU was something like that, of territories without borders, but and in a way your talk has as a utopian horizon that possibility with powerful arguments, which I like more than your arguments about Israel. But nevertheless, I mean, that dream still exists, but it has never been successful. Now, why different from the dream about a globally accepted temporality, the ideas of a globally accepted spatiality have never been agreed upon? I think the answer is quite easy, because as space, phenomenologically, is based on the physical presence of a body, you cannot imagine and you cannot draw borders or lines without a threat of violence. And that is different from temporality. How do I define violence? I have a much narrower definition than, for example, the much admired Michel Foucault. I define violence as the occupation of spaces through bodies against the resistance of other bodies. The occupation of spaces with bodies, with physical bodies, against the resistance of other bodies. That is violence, and that would include criminal acts as rape. This is the occupation of a space with a body against the resistance of another body. Now, this, and I would say inevitable threat of violence, whenever we have imaginations about space, is the real reason, and the better reason than some Enlightenment dreams, of the bias that intellectuals have against spatial orders. We feel uneasy against spatial orders. We feel uneasy about proposals of spatial orders because there is an awareness that, more clear or unclear awareness, that whenever we do that, there is a threat of violence, not only in the air, but physically there. Now, in spite of that danger, and the danger that, of course, implies nationhood. Whenever you think about nationhood, you cannot avoid to think about spatial orders, spatial articulation, spatial borders of that nation. And once you do that, there is a threat of violence. In spite of that, and fully aware of that, I'll try to make two arguments in favor of borders, and in a way in favor of, let me call it, a soft concept of nationhood. A soft concept of nationhood in the sense, personally speaking, that I changed my nationality in the year 2000. I used to be a German citizen, and I'm now a US citizen, and I must be the only humanities professor in the US, but maybe the reason is that I'm an emeritus professor who is proud to have an American passport. So I pledge that I'm proud to belong to this nation for all the problems that this nation may have. But that is not important for my argument. My first argument in favor of borders and nationhood is an argument of overwhelming complexity. I think without nations and without certain borders, our life turns into overwhelming complexity. Let me give you one practical example that we all have, and that is electronic communication. Electronic communication is a communication that has made it possible, that has enabled us. Otherwise, we couldn't be co-present in a certain way here to communicate across borders and across nations. And thanks to Google Translation, even languages are no longer borders. And that is all beautiful, and that is a great conquest. But if I talk about my personal life, and maybe you share this experience, I mean, this mega communication, this communication that never stops, is also eating up our privacy. Yeah, I mean, there is no moment on the day where I don't receive WhatsApps from Europe, text messages from the US, or countries where text messages don't cost as much as in Europe, and where my email screen doesn't accumulate when I don't control it for 1 hour or so. It is just too much. And in the sense of this complexity, that is not just the complexity of electronic communication, but I wanted to illustrate by electronic communication, I think to have nations in the sense of a prioritizing of communication, for example. Not exclusively prioritizing, but saying, okay, the likelihood that I communicate with somebody, let's talk of a small country, in Italy, is greater than the likelihood than communicating with somebody in Spain. The likelihood of playing soccer or baseball in the Middle American countries with somebody from your country is greater than playing with somebody from Japan, is not a great conquest, but I think it is a reduction of complexity that, among other things, protects our private life, not by making our private life exclusive or drawing borders, but by prioritizing. So my first argument is that as long as nations exist and an awareness of nations exist, we have a certain prioritizing that may protect us in a certain way against this undermining of privacy. The second argument is maybe less obvious, more problematic, but this is exactly the reason, maybe also more provocative, why I want to make it. And this is an argument in favor of intensity. So I will give you a definition of intensity, but I presuppose that most of us, not only intellectuals, existentially appreciate, like, moments of intensity. So we don't want to give up moments of intensity. So being a sports fan without any talents to practice sports myself, I absolutely love to be present in stadiums. Yeah, not just by TV, but I have season tickets for too many sports as far as my finances are concerned, because I love to be in a stadium. I have season tickets for the San Jose Sharks. I have season tickets for Stanford American football, however bad they are playing. And I used to have season tickets for the San Francisco Giants because I love to be in a stadium. Now, a stadium, people don't talk much about that, is, of course, I call stadiums places of intensity. A stadium is a place that has a clear border, a physical border. I mean, there are people who are inside the stadium, there are people who are outside the stadium. So it's a border place, and you have comparatively, by present-day demographic standards, small number of people standing or sitting next to each other. And I believe that stadiums, not exclusively, but very obviously, are places where intensity happens. Now, what do I mean when I say intensity? In the first place, I mean something that I greatly enjoy. I buy season tickets because of the intensity, not necessarily because I want the San Jose Sharks to finally win the Stanley Cup, which they never will. The Stanley Cup is the championship in ice hockey in the United States, but I like to be in their stadium. Now, what is intensity then? As everybody quotes Deleuze, as we say in the United States, Gilles Deleuze, so I will quote his definition. He defines intensity as a process that leads from absolute randomness to an existence as a body without organs to being a black hole. So that's a feeling when you are in a stadium. Before the game begins, you sit or stand next to each other, and you could have any type of relationship, any type of legal relationship with that person. But if the game is good and if the game is going on, all of a sudden you become, almost in a literal sense, one body. When the person next to you is starting to sing, especially in South American stadiums, you will sing too. Or if people start hopping, that can be very dangerous, you start hopping too. Just as a footnote again, you don't have this intensity without a certain degree of a threat of physical violence. Stadiums have often become places of physical violence, but at the same time, I do appreciate intensity. And to a certain degree, I think intensities are not only given in stadiums, provided, facilitated by stadiums, and the analogy is problematic, but and has many bad historical examples. But I would say nations can also become places of intensity. And as I've already talked about sports, I'll give you two examples. So the first example is the Soccer World Cup in Germany in 2006 that Germans refer to as the summer fairy tale of Germany. Germany did not win that World Cup, although Germany used to always be a candidate to win that World Cup. But during the 3 weeks of that World Cup in 2006 that took place in Germany, a Stimmung, an intensity emerged in the country that the country is nostalgically remembering until the present day as this so-called Sommermärchen. And the Sommermärchen was not something exclusively to soccer. It was a feeling within the host country that was absolutely fabulous. Needless to say, something similar and inoffensive can happen. Think of Argentina last year when a country wins a World Cup. Yeah, I mean, in the very depressed economic and not only economic situation of Argentina, without any doubts, one shouldn't say something like that, one of my favorite countries on the globe. I mean, I was unfortunately not there, but when Argentina in this fabulous World Cup final, memorable World Cup final against France won the World Cup, there was an intensity and a euphoria in Argentina as a nation that had never happened before. So, I mean, as you're seeing, I'm trying to make an argument for intensity. And I say there is no intensity without spatial borders. Maybe that's sad, but I will say I have a hard time imagining intensity happen at the scale of humankind. Now, let me finish by making a couple of arguments that would perhaps enable us to appreciate nationhood, to appreciate belonging to a nation, both from a historical and from a philosophical perspective, without being called a fascist or a nationalist. I start with a counterexample. A couple of years ago, I did a seminar with entrepreneurs, businessmen in Switzerland, and I was surprised to hear from them that they had a desire to replace nationhood and paying taxes, being a citizen of the Swiss nation, for example. So wouldn't it be much better to have something like clubs, like not corporations in the corporate sense, where you would pay a membership fee, and by paying a membership fee, they would do everything for you that a state or a nation normally do for you. I mean, as oftentimes when I talk to Swiss entrepreneurs, this was an interesting idea because it was far out. It really surprised me, especially in Switzerland. You can make all kinds of arguments against it, but my main argument at this point was that this type of community replacing nations would be a type of community that would never produce intensity. Yeah? That would never produce intensity, that would never produce a Sommermärchen, that would never produce the euphoria in Argentina last year when they won the World Cup, because it is an idea that has no possibility for a spatial articulation. And let me now make a historical argument, philosophical argument in favor of nationhood, with all the negative connotations that the word deservedly has. What really are we referring to, legally speaking, when we speak of nationhood? We speak of the legalization of the random fact of your birthplace. I by no means chose to be born in the American occupied zone of Germany, such the stamp on my birth certificate in 1948. It was clearly the worst place you could have chosen to be born in 1948. I would say at even worse than in Israel, which was even not founded in 1948. But anyway, I did not choose, and nevertheless, being born in the American occupied zone of Germany made me 1 year later, when the Federal Republic was founded, the Federal Republic of Germany was founded, a member of the German nation. Yeah, and until the year 2000, I had a German passport and I was a member of the German nation. Now, I find that quite remarkable philosophically. There is, from your subjective point of view, an absolute randomness where you're born. Nobody can choose to be born at all, as Kant is saying, let alone to choose the place. And nevertheless, that becomes by law decisive to the community you are part of. Yeah, by the non-chosen place of your birth, you become part of nationhood. Now, this relation between the law and nationhood becomes, historically speaking, a predicate of the citizen. So citizenship, in the Republican sense, citizenship as it was first thought and then institutionally introduced by the new type of government, no longer monarchical government, counts on citizenship and nationhood. As a citizen, you are part of a nation. And once again, I want to say maybe being part of a nation is something too much underappreciated today because of my arguments of reduction of complexity, because of my argument in terms of intensity for all its problems. I finish with 4 sentences about what could be changes in the status of nationhood, what could be changes in the status of borders that would make the situation more bearable and thereby kind of prevent some of the arguments that one could make against my pledge. Of course, and there I absolutely agree with you, Ed. I mean, as I disagreed so much with you on Israel, I have overemphasized the agreements, but that's a nice effect of a discussion. Yes, I would think there should be a higher degree of permeability. Yeah, I mean, like in my own case. So after all, it was possible to become an American citizen after waiting for 11 years. And it was even possible, because that's the law since Pearl Harbor, to abandon my German citizenship. For certain symbolic reasons, I wanted to abandon my German citizenship, and I managed. I had to go to the consulate in San Francisco and swear into the face of the German consulate in San Francisco that I no longer wanted to be a German citizen. But nevertheless, it was possible, but it would have been nicer if it had been more permeable. That, executing Pearl Harbor by becoming an American citizen, I'm no longer a German citizen, but more permeability. Secondly, I would say if nations continue to exist and if that has something positive, one should rethink the status of the United Nations. Yeah, maybe the United Nations have become too much of a deteriorated dream of enlightenment. Maybe the United Nations should have greater power, and I'm not excluding the idea of military power here to intervene in certain international conflicts, but that may be a dream. I would also say, I mean, although I'm no longer a European taxpayer or a European citizen, that it is perhaps high time to abandon certain projects of abandoning nations, double negation, that have been unsuccessful and have turned into administrative and taxpayers' nightmare like the European Union. I mean, as I'm not a German citizen or an EU citizen anymore, I have no saying there, but I don't see really who wants to hold on to the European Union except for the representatives who are sitting in Luxembourg and Strasbourg and who are making real good money for a function that does not exist. And I would finally go so far, and that's my last nostalgic memory, if I think of Europe, that a certain emphasis of borders, visible emphasis of borders, could have a positive effect in the sense of underlining cultural difference and cultural otherness. I mean, I was not only born in the American occupied zone of Germany, but I was also born in the Free State of Bavaria in southern Germany. And among the 18 German federal states, the Free State of Bavaria is the only one that marks its border. When you drive on the freeway, on the Autobahn in Germany, and you enter Bavaria, there's actually a sign, exclamation mark. You're now entering the Free State of Bavaria, and you will notice that because people speak with a different accent. People have a certain Catholic background, even if they're not practicing Catholics, and so forth and so forth. So I think a visibilization of cultural difference through certain border rituals is not the worst thing we could practice. So many thanks for your attention. And I can see on the faces that you're all terribly disappointed, but that was not my intention.
Thank you so much. I don't know about others. I'm not disappointed at all. We still have some minutes, for questions. Boris.
As I heard your talk, and I agree with many things that you said, it's striking me that I was speaking in English, and we were also speaking in English. So I switched my Russian, native Russian from English, and I switched your native German to English. And I began to think about language borders. So is it really true that the translation erases the borders among languages? And of course, I quote Heidegger in my text, and Heidegger insisted on the unity between language and territory and impossibility of translation, of perfect translation from one language to another language, also using Greek, ancient Greek as example.
Yeah.
And of course, also I feel that I cannot translate my Russian into English. I even cannot translate my German into English, as you know.
Right.
I wrote a lot in German and spoke a lot in German, and it also doesn't work. Yeah. So, to what degree to leave a territory is at the same time to leave a certain language, or to what degree leave a certain language means to leave a certain territory? And do we not, both of us, enter some kind of, I would say, imperial territory? So not universal and world, but also not national. Using English language, we are obviously using imperial language in the same way in which medieval Europe, early Europe used Roman language, Latin language. So,
okay. Oh, sorry.
So what is about this, I would say, artificial territory? What I want to say is that speaking about nation, you speak about nature, natural territory, natural language. Is something like an artificial territory possible?
I have no answer to that question, but I just wrote it down. But I wanted to give two answers that continue our discussion. I think it very much continues where we were after your talk. In the first place, I would actually not call English an imperial language. It always has this bad 19th century connotation. I like to call it a koine. Yeah, and a koine like Greek in the ancient world, and like a koine was certainly Latin in the medieval world. So that is a language that, to use my own concept, increases permeability, and that is very, very beautiful, and otherwise would be much more difficult to have, for example, an intellectual meeting that we have now. But at the same time, and that is a second answer, and it's not an answer about space, at the same time, I have an answer about space, actually. At the same time, give an example. After 10 years and making the very negative experience that for some reason English is one of the foreign languages that I speak where I continue to have an accent. After 35 years in the US and being an American citizen, I continue to have an accent, which I hate. So I took instructors to erase that accent. I was unsuccessful. And then I talked to graduate students, and the graduate students of mine said, no, Seb, this is really, I mean, this is so beautiful that you have this German accent in your American English. I think that is a very American attitude that I like, but that I would like not to be only American. You get my point. I mean, this is what I mean by permeability, that on the one hand, we have a koine in which we all can speak, but in the other hand, instead of saying no, I mean, like I wanted to, you have to erase your German accent in American English, or my American-born kids are saying it is some kind of an accent. Instead of erasing that, we appreciate that. That's you. That's individuality, and doesn't prevent us from communicating. As far as the space is concerned, I mean, I come back to an example that I was bringing up in a discussion of your presentation, Boris. That would be the type of megalopolis that I think is very, very different from metropolis, from what Paris used to be in the 19th century, the Paris that Benjamin calls the capital of the 19th century. Sao Paulo, for example, or Tokyo to a certain degree, or Lagos. Yeah, I mean, where you have a certain fluidity among cultures that has a certain spatial articulation. I mean, Japantown, as they call it in Sao Paulo, is not everywhere, but you may find it everywhere in Sao Paulo. So precisely, and maybe, you know, there's even a semantic affinity to the way that Ed was using boundary. So yes, I can imagine, in the full sense of imagination, without being able to define it, a spatial status, a spatial state, also associable with what we call, in a too learned word, cosmopolitanism, that would do justice to this fluid omnipresence between cultures that you, Boris, exemplified so beautiful by referring to English, that we all speak with an accent, but nevertheless, we speak in that language.
Any other questions? Yeah, please, Ed.
I mean, I have to say, after that, I have to leave because I'm already late for the appointment. Sorry. Yeah, Ed.
Hans, great talk. Really, many things to talk about. One thing you didn't talk about, concern of mine, yes, one more, is the role of place, what I call place, which I think is in between borders and boundaries. Yeah. And is the third term that we need to reinvigorate and rethink, because it has neither the arbitrariness of a border, nor is it altogether pegged to nature, as is boundary on my definition. And it seems to me that your very interesting re-emphasis upon borders, nationhood, may not give room enough to
no, definitely not.
Place.
Place is the much better concept for that.
You would agree. Okay. Well, I think it's really important because, yes, as Husserl,
may I run with it, because this is
yeah. Okay. Of course.
Okay.
Anyway.
I give you an example because you're probably familiar with the place I'm referring to, and that is the place from which I'm speaking, and that is Stanford campus. Yeah, I mean, that is a very specific place. I mean, you see, when you come from Palo Alto, you have this University Avenue with these tree collections that the Stanfords invented and the palm trees. And you see the main quadrangle, the main quad in the background, and the foothills in the background. So it is a very specific landscape, which interestingly was partly artificially created when the campus was founded, because the Danish-American architect Olmsted, who was the most expensive architect, the same who designed Central Park in New York, whom Stanford hired because he said, as a good capitalist, the more expensive, the better, thought to make the church more visible, they had to raise a little bit the territory. So it's not completely natural, which is a very American story. But the place, Stanford as a place, I have a prejudice against place because I always hear the Heideggerian connotation. That's odd. Yeah, that's the reason. But you're right, place is the word. Yeah. So I actually feel existentially that's my place. And I have that for the first time of my life. I didn't have that in the so-called American occupied zone of Germany, nor of Germany, but Stanford, I'm living on campus, it is this fluid community. There is no majority. I mean, you don't ask yourself, oh, is this an American student or is this a Russian student? I mean, there's a fluid intellectual community. Everybody has an accent. There is a capacity for intensity, not only in the football stadium. That is my place. That is my place. And that exactly, and I apologize, has to be my last word, but this is nice if we end up on such an agreement. That is precisely what I wanted to make a pledge for. Because I think with dreams like the European Union, et cetera, and to a certain degree also with the humankind legacy of enlightenment, we run a risk of losing that feeling for place. Yeah, that feeling for place. I mean, in the 76th year of my life, there is not much of a likelihood that I will ever buy a new house somewhere else, et cetera, that will remain my place. But place always means that you could also move to another place and nobody could prevent you from doing that. Okay, thank you. And now I see smiling faces.
Well, thank you so much, Sepp, and I'll switch into Russian, in a way, because you still have the interpreter.
And I say bye-bye because
bye-bye.
bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.